building 101B. So we had a statement from Shmuel that you're allowed to redeem something even though it's still pure. We had a contradiction. The contradiction was before we get to that, first we had a statement from Rabbi that according to Reb Shimon, Pigel is not metamet masaychan. Rabbi says that in order for food to contract tumah, in order for anything to contract tumah, it needs to be edible. It needs to be inedible. So if it's inedible but it's not halachically edible, so Rabbi says that according to Reb Shimon, it's not considered inedible. So therefore it won't be tummy. We had a contradiction on that from a Bais. And the Bais said that pigel by a mincha is metamet masaychan. Exactly the opposite. Even though it's not a halachically edible, it's still considered a food. So we answered, it depends. If it had a shasa kosher, if it had a time that it wasn't edible, then it's considered a food. But if it didn't have a time that it wasn't edible, then it's not considered a food. So that resolves the problem. But this was a proof. The Gemara said that this was a proof that if it had a time that it wasn't edible, so then it's tamig, that's great. But even if it didn't have a time that it was edible, why don't you just redeem it according to Shmuel? According to Shmuel, you can redeem it. And that would make it into an edible. So we responded to that, well, he didn't redeem it. They said, well, so what? Reb Shimon holds that potential is also something, even if you didn't redeem it. But the fact that you could have redeemed it should turn it into a food. So we said we made a difference between the paraduma, which you can redeem, and the carbon mincha, which you can redeem. A paraduma is a mitzvah to redeem if you find a better one. But by the mincha, there's no mitzvah to redeem it, even if you find a better one. Why? Because this is your carbon. You don't just hand it in and exchange it for another one. The Gemara asks, where it's let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines from the bottom. It's 2 lines up from the wide lines. It says v'halon lefnei zrika. Go back to the beginning of the Bais. The Bais that we just discussed, that what contradicted Rabbi. Bais said that a carbon mincha, if it's pigel, it's still considered an edible. But the beginning of that Bais said that there's a difference. It's talking about nicer. That means a sacrifice that was left overnight. And Reb Shimon said that sometimes nicer is metamet masaychan, and sometimes nicer is not metamet masaychan. That means sometimes nicer is considered an edible, sometimes nicer, the ibrigablivina, the leftover sacrifice until the morning, sometimes it's not considered an edible. Edible because it's halachically not edible. And the Mishnah explained what was the difference. It was a brisa. If it was left overnight before Zrika, it was never an edible, so it's not metamet masaychan. If it was left overnight after Zrika, then it wasn't edible because you could have eaten it after the Zrika, but you didn't. So now, even though now it's possible, but now it's not an edible.
Edible.
It's not now. It's not edible. Halach.
Right.
There's a side question. She mosa cheres noyim mena. Is that a common thing in a mitzvah?
No.
I don't recall that very
right.
specific to paraduma. There's
I don't know.
special.
That's a good point. I don't know.
Such a mod nazach. He's saying even if it's already on there,
Mitzvah liftais, right?
No, if you're matzah cheres noyim.
Right.
What does it mean cheres noyim mena in a paraduma?
Fatter.
Rather.
So that's going to be a problem.
Whole thing is very.
The term matzacher snai mena is used in a bad connotation. It's used by
Tomorrow.
it's used by divorce.
Oh.
Why is someone allowed to divorce? Matzacher snai mena. That's the expression.
Really?
According to one
I think
opinion.
Rabbi Akiva
According
says
to one opinion. So we're saying that if it's left overnight and it was before Zrika, so it's not edible because you didn't do the Zrika. It's not edible now because it's left overnight, but it's not edible anyway. It never had a time that it should be considered an edible, so therefore it shouldn't be. It's not tummy. The only problem is that according to everything that we've just explained, is there a mitzvah to sprinkle the blood before it became nighttime? Of course. Reb Shimon holds that anything that is potentially done is considered like it's done, especially if there's a mitzvah to do it, like we just said by the paradum, it's a mitzvah to redeem it. So the mitzvah lemizrake, over there is a mitzvah to sprinkle the blood. V'ibayizarek, and if he wanted to, he could have. And therefore we should say that it's as if he did it, because Reb Shimon looks at the potential. And he says if you had potential to sprinkle the blood, it's as if you sprinkled it. If you sprinkled the blood, would it have been edible? Yes. So why is this not considered tamei tumasaychlan? Why is it not considered an edible? It had potential to be an edible, it's considered an edible. Uktani dein metamei tumasaychlan. And we say that it's not considered an edible, it doesn't become tamei. Gemara says, Hachamay Eskinan, here with what are we dealing? You actually did not even have potential to sprinkle it. Why? Because by the time you were up to the sprinkling of that part of the sacrifice to sprinkle the blood, it was already shkia. It was already too late. There was no potential.
Aren't the kohanim?
Zrizim? Yeah, but it was so quick that it was. You didn't even for Zrizim.
Why would they start?
Why does Allah take off right before Shabbos?
It's the same concept.
Right. That's
Why
the
are the
question.
people on the plane?
But let's say there was time by the day. You see, what happens is when you start to allow yourself to give these answers, that we're talking about a case where there wasn't time, what that means to tell you is that in a case where there was time, we have to go back and change the law. What would the din be then if there was time to sprinkle the blood? Metame to masaychlin. It would be tame. So aditani, in place of teaching law and lachar zrika, we have two cases here. One is if it stayed overnight after the blood was sprinkled, and one was the case where it stayed overnight before the blood was sprinkled. If it's before the blood was sprinkled, it's not considered food. If it's after the blood was sprinkled, it is considered food. Why do we need to divide it into those two cases? I have a better contrast. Was there time to sprinkle the blood, or was there not time to sprinkle the blood? And both of them, the blood wasn't sprinkled. And then it would have the same contrast. If we're looking to contrast it.
You find the smallest difference.
In place of teaching that if it was it stayed overnight after the blood was sprinkled, it is considered food. Liflik b'dida, divide it with its original case. And when do we say that it's considered that it's not considered food? If there was no time during the day. But if there was time during the day, it should be tamei. So the Gemara answers hachinami kamar. That's exactly what it means to say. Lan kodim sheyira lizrika. If it was stayed overnight before there was potential to sprinkle, it's not tamei. But le'achar sheyira lizrika. If it stayed overnight after there was potential to sprinkle it, mitami tumasaychlan, then it will be tamei as food. It's considered an edible. Okay. We sort of resolved this brisa, at least the beginning of the brisa, and now we go to the end of the brisa. V'hapigol. No, We're still discussing before. Now we're at the middle of the brisa. We had three cases in the brisa. We had lon, we had pigel, and then we had pigel by mincha. So we dealt with lon, which lon means it stays overnight. We said that the contrast is if there was time by day. Now we're up to pigel. In the case of pigel is v'ha pigel bein mekadshe kadash and bein mekadshe kalam mitzvah lemizrakei. If the pigel was on the sprinkling of the blood, so pigel was thoughts, improper thoughts of when he's going to eat the sacrifice. The kohen is sprinkling the blood, and he has thoughts that he's going to eat the sacrifice out of the allotted time, so the sacrifice becomes invalid. So right when he's about to sprinkle the blood, right at that moment, he's about to sprinkle the blood. He has a mitzvah to sprinkle the blood. Reb Shimon holds that potential before he messed it up, before he sprinkled it. He has potential to sprinkle it. So at that time, it becomes potentially food. Because Reb Shimon holds that a potential is as if it's done. So why are we saying that this is not considered a food? Because you messed it up when you sprinkled the blood, you had the wrong thoughts. Before he sprinkled it, there was potential to sprinkle it properly. And we just made a difference between, is it a mitzvah to do it or is it not a mitzvah? And of course it's a mitzvah to do it. So why are we saying that it's not food? Mitzvah mizrukei, Bais, and if he wants, he's able to sprinkle the blood. And we say that it's not considered an edible. According to Reb Shimon, it should be considered an edible.
Edible.
An edible.
Edible.
Right. An edible.
M?
A edible. But if it starts with a
like
vowel. An edible.
That's the accent.
Yeah, no, I know, but it sounds like inedible. It's the opposite.
That's the accent.
We'll have to drop the "and."
Sorry.
Just say I don't know English. It's fine.
You can eat it.
So I have that with don't or can't. Are you saying can or can? I'm saying can. Okay. So it's if there's potential, it should be considered like it was already done.
Right.
And there's not only potential, but there's even a mitzvah. So the Gemara explains, my love, is it not the pigel bezrika? That where would these thoughts? Right at the end of this, the very last service of the sacrifice is the sprinkling of the blood. If this would have been done properly, it would have been a valid sacrifice and it would have been edible. This last sacrifice, this last service was not done properly. But what we're asking here is that it had potential to be done properly, so it should be considered edible. The Gemara says, "Loi, the pigel b'shchita. The pigel was not in the last part of the sacrifice. It was at the beginning of the sacrifice. So it was already messed up. By the time the zrika came around, the shchita was already done improperly. It never had potential. Aval pigel b'zrika. You see, once again." When you give me that example, now we have to go back and say, well, what would be in the example that you just rejected? What would be the law there? Aval pigel bezrika. But if there was the forbidden thoughts, not forbidden thoughts, the thoughts that mess up the sacrifice, at the end of the service, by the sprinkling of the blood, which is the last service of the sacrifice, what would be the din? It would be considered edible, and it would contract impurity as a food. So the Gemara now asks, if that's the case, the tani pigel b'mincha, why did you give two cases? One case was pigel by a sacrifice, and another case was pigel by a mincha. Pigel by a sacrifice we said was not edible. Pigel by a mincha we said was edible. Why do you have to divide up to contrast when it's edible and you use a different sacrifice, an animal sacrifice versus a mincha? You said that pigel by mincha is metamit to masaychla and it's considered edible. Now, simply, why would a mincha be edible? Because a mincha, but a mincha, before it's turned into a mincha, it was flour which you can eat. So it had a moment where it was an edible. However, by a sacrifice, you can't eat a live animal. It's a limb off a living animal. when you shech the animal, it's already a sacrifice, and if the sacrifice is messed up, it never has potential to be edible. So that was the original thought of why this should be the contrast, that this was edible and this was not edible at a certain moment. The mincha was edible because you grow the grain. Now we responded that Shmuel held that pigul by a mincha was not edible. And here we have a brisa that says pigul by mincha is edible. We resolved that contradiction by saying it depends when he sanctified the grain. Did he sanctify the grain after the harvest or before the harvest? If it was before the harvest, then it was never edible. If it's after the harvest, and during that time, it had a shasa kosher, it had time that it was edible. But now the Gemara is asking that why do you need that to do that contrast between a sacrifice and a mincha? In the sacrifice itself, I have the contrast. Why? Liflik b'didah, divide a sacrifice itself. But med devarim amurim, when do we say these words? That it's not considered edible. The pigul b'shchita, that's when the thoughts of pigul were at the beginning of the sacrifice, because it never had potential to be a valid sacrifice. He messed it up right at the start. Aval pigul b'zrika, but if his thoughts are at the end of the sacrifice, before the very last service, so that last service, the sprinkling of the blood, before he sprinkled the blood, was potential to be a valid service, even though he messed it up when he actually did it. But that would be metamet masaychlin. So the Gemara explains that no, we wanted specifically to have the contrast between an animal and the mincha. Why? Because pigul b'mincha it's strichale. It's necessary to teach this to me. Pigul by a mincha, that it's nevertheless valid. It's a big chiddush. The afagav the pigul b'kmitza the kaimitz b'mincha k'shchita dami. Because what we're doing by the mincha is we're saying that I have two cases of pigul by shchita. One is valid and one is not valid. One is considered edible and one is not considered edible. One is by an animal sacrifice. By the shchita, it's considered not edible. And by the shchita, by a mincha, it's considered edible. Now, there's no shchita by a mincha because you don't slaughter grain or flour. But the kmitza by a mincha is comparable to the shchita of a sacrifice, because there's four sacrifices there's four components to an animal sacrifice, and they correspond to the components of the mincha sacrifice. Which component corresponds to the shchita? The kmitza. So we wanted to show that the shchita component of the sacrifice, of an animal sacrifice, makes the animal inedible, and therefore it's not tamei tumasaychlan, it can't contract tuma. But the shchita component of a mincha sacrifice would make it edible.
What are the four components? Meaning shchita?
Well, no, actually the smicha isn't part of it. It's the shchita, the receiving the blood, the taking it to the altar, and the sprinkling of the blood on the altar.
Not the way they eat it?
Well, only certain sacrifices have it. These are the four components that are by all sacrifices. By the mincha, it's the kaimetz, then it's the taking it up to the altar, and then it's the burning it on the altar.
Putting it in a kli.
Oh, putting it in a kli would be the kabbalah sadam. Yeah, the kmitza, putting it in the keli. Thank you. The bringing it up and then the burning it. Okay. Afilu hachi, that even though it's a shchita, comparable to shchita, metami to masaychlen, nevertheless it's considered edible. Because originally, when it was grain, before he sanctified it, it was considered edible. Okay. Amar Ravashi says, Amrisa l'shmaita kameder Rav Nachman. I said this over to Rav Nachman. And Ravashi is going to add something in, but Tosfos over here says that it's impossible. Ravashi never saw Rav Nachman, and he proves it. He says Rav Nachman was the teacher of Rava, and Rav Nachman passed away before Rava. And then we have a Gemara that says that on the day that Rava died, Ravashi was born. So if Rav Nachman passed away before Rava, and when Rava dies, Ravashi is born, Ravashi couldn't have seen Rav Nachman. So Tosfos says the Girsa should be Rav Kahana. And there was another Rav Kahana, besides the Rav Kahana that was a student of Rav, there was another one that was later. That's a Tosfos in other places. That there were two Rav Kahanas. He says, however, Tosfos says, but by the way, it still could be Rav Nachman. If it's not the famous Rav Nachman, if it's Rav Nachman by Yitzchak. It was a later Rav Nachman. He says it could be that. Okay. Interesting. So Rav Ashi says he said over this teaching in front of Rav Nachman, and he added on a point. He says, Afilu tema lon mamish. We said, if you go back to the brisa that we said before, if something is left overnight, we say that it's not considered, we said there were two options. Sometimes it's considered edible, sometimes it's not edible. It depends. If it was before the zrika, then it's not considered edible. There was no zrika there. If it was done after the zrika, then it is considered edible. So we asked, but really, if you had potential to do the zrika, according to Reb Shimon, that should already be considered edible. So we answered that. We said that there was no time by day to do the zrika. All right? That's how we answered it. Rav Ashi comes along and says to Rav Nachman, we don't need to say that. We can go back to the original understanding. Was there zrika? Was there no zrika? He says, lon mamish. It means literally that it stayed overnight. What he means to say is zrika mamish, that either there was zrika or there was no zrika. Literally, not potential to do the zrika. If the zrika was done, then it's considered edible. If there was no zrika, no sprinkling of the blood, then it's not considered edible, even if there was potential to do the zrika. But that's a problem. Reb Shimon says potential is as if it was done. Va'afilu tema depigel bizrika. And even if we're going to say that the thoughts that he had was at the zrika, in the second case, that he had thoughts at the zrika itself, which is the last service, which means that he only messed it up at the very end, which means that right before he did it, there was potential to be a valid sacrifice. And Reb Shimon looks at potential. He explains, Rav Ashi says, Di boi parakam ninan, Reb Shimon looks at potential only by redeeming an animal, which we saw by the para aduma. Di boi havizarek layam ninan, but he doesn't look at the potential by the zrika. Why? So Rashi explains here that the potential to redeem is all verbal. There's no action that's lacking. He says this should be instead of that. This money should be in place of that. He doesn't need to do anything. But when he's missing an action like zrika, the sprinkling of the blood is something that he really needs to do. If he didn't do it, he didn't do it.
So he doesn't agree that kimus v'sayim of a ma'isa.
That would be
According
at least he would say that it's not the same as the full action. Okay, that's a big discussion. Kimus v'sayim.
That's what Rashi learns it?
Yeah. Which one was it?
Non mamish.
Yeah, the end of Lan Mamish, he says, Dvarim ba'alma nenu. Ibai parek is Dvarim ba'alma, but by Yazarek, that's a full Maisa, and that we're not going to say. The Shita in the Kabetzis adds in a few words and make it easier. Chusar Maisa.
So if it's words, it's kepodri dami.
Right.
If it's action, that
Right.
we're not going to do.
Right. So now what we've just said is that if the Zrika wasn't done, even if there was potential for Zrika, Reb Shimon would not accept that as considered that it was edible. Meisvei, we have a question. Klal Amar Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua gave a rule. Kol shahisa le'shasa keisha l'kayanim, ein mayalim ba. The way it works is like this. If someone sanctifies an animal as a sacrifice, so if someone then has personal benefit from it, so he had benefit from something that belongs to God. Very strict laws of me'ilah. He has to bring an asham me'ilah. If he does it b'mezid, it could be it's misa b'dei shamayim, it's a death penalty from heaven. Very severe laws of using something for personal use that belongs to Hekdesh. However, once the services of the sacrifice were performed, it leaves the status of Hekdesh and it goes to the status of being edible to the Kayanim. So once it becomes edible to the Kayanim, then there's no more Me'ilah. Maybe you weren't supposed to eat it because you're not a Kayan, Or maybe you are a kain and you are supposed to eat it, but there's no more me'ila. You see, me'ila would apply to a kain as well. A kain can't use it if he's not allowed to have it, if it's sanctified to God. So the rule is, kol shahaisale shas heter lakainim, once it had a moment of permissibility to the kayanim, ein ma'ilim ba. It's not considered me'ila anymore. It's not considered that violation. Kol shaloi haisale shas heter lakayanim, and as long as there was never a moment of permissibility to the kayan, then ma'ilim ba, then there is me'ila. Now the wording here is shahaisalai. It's the what do they call it? Past participle. It has had a moment, right? Has had a moment of permissibility. It doesn't say that it is permissible. It has had a moment, right? Okay. Ve'ezu shaseta l'kayin. What would be the permissibility to the kayin? What would be that case? In other words, we're looking for a case that is actually not permissible right now, but it had a moment. Shalana v'shenitma v'sheyatza. It stayed overnight, and it became impure, or it left. And we're talking about over here that the blood wasn't sprinkled yet. So why would it be? Oh, and we're saying that even though the blood wasn't sprinkled, but it still would be considered permissible. I guess because it had potential to sprinkle the blood, and that's what we're going to ask. Because here we're going to see that potential to sprinkle the blood is considered that the blood was sprinkled. What's something that was never permissible? The shechita was done wrong. The shechita had thoughts, the beginning part of the sacrifice, and out of its time and out of it, the thoughts were to eat it out of its allotted time and to eat it out of its allotted place, or to sprinkle the blood. And people that were not eligible to receive the blood, and someone that's not a kayan, and they went and they sprinkled the blood as well. But we're saying that it was messed up, the sacrifice was invalid from an earlier stage. But nevertheless, it was taught in the beginning of this brisa, Mishnah, Shalana v'shenitma v'shiyatza, that it stayed overnight, it became impure, and it left. My love, is it not? Lana mamish, that it literally stayed overnight. But what it means, literally stayed overnight, means it literally, the blood was not sprinkled, as opposed to potential or not potential and all of that. V'hachen, in this case, the boy havizaraku. If he wanted, he could have sprinkled the blood. And we're saying that the potential to sprinkle the blood, uktani dein ma'ilamba, that it's not considered mila. The potential was considered like it was done, even though it's an action. This contradicts Rav Ashi's din. The Gemara answers lie. That's not the case. Ru'uya latzis, ru'uya letame, ru'uya lalin. What it actually means is that the blood was already sprinkled. And we said that it's a case of has had a time that it was permissible. We have to change that. But we're talking about, what does it mean? It had potential to be invalid by staying overnight, by becoming tummy, and by leaving. It has potential now, since everything was done perfectly, it has potential now to be invalid with these other things, because it's already valid in all the services that its sacrifice requires.
So the clarification is that there's two types of lina. If you shech the animal and you didn't sprinkle the blood and it came to the sunset, it's gone. That's one type of lina. Right. The other type of lina, you shechted, you sprinkled the blood, but you didn't finish eating it by the morning.
Right. And now we're saying the second one is where it's considered where there's no me'ila, because it was done already. Avalina mamish, you see, now we go back to this problem. But if it means that it actually stayed overnight before the sprinkling of the blood, hachanami d'mailin, it would have been me'ila. So the Gemara now asks, Haikol shahayolei shaset l'kayinim, v'chol shaloi haisolei shaset l'kayinim. That phrase, anything that has had permissibility to the kainim, or has not had permissibility to the kainim, is incorrect. Kol sheyesh leishas heter lekainim ein ma'ila ba. Something that is permissible to the kainim is not meila. Kol she'ein leishas heter lekainim ma'ila ba. Anything that's not permissible to the kainim, it should not be meila. It's not a potential, because now we're saying that when does the meila go away? Only if the blood was actually sprinkled. Mi ba'ilei, it should have said. Ela maravashi. They take out the Ella. No, then they put the Ella back in. All right. Ravashi says, Me'ila tumakaramis. You're asking the question. You see, we use two different sets of halachas. We're using the same zrika to ask the question, but we're using two different sets of halachas. One is in the laws of Tumah. If you open up the Tumah, laws of Tumah, Shulchan Aruch. So over there we said that the zrika makes it eligible to become tamei because it makes it edible. But if the zrika was not performed, even though there was potential, the potential zrika does not make it edible. That's what we said. That's what Rav Ashi said earlier. Now we open up another Shulchan Aruch, and it's the Shulchan Aruch of Me'ila. In the laws of Me'ila, we said that the zrika makes it that it's considered permissible to the kainim, but not only that, potential for zrika also makes it permissible to the kainim. It's the same zrika, but it's in a different set of laws. And why? Why should we say this difference? Me'ila mishum kedusha. Me'ila has to do with the sanctity that's on it. V'lav kedusha, or the sanctity that's not on it. So the v'lav kedushi. L'basa depakala kedushasa b'may hajar rachvala. Once there's potential for the kedusha to go off, so that potential, the kedusha just has to leave because he had potential to sprinkle the blood, and we consider it like it's done, so the kedusha can leave. But tumah mishamuchla, tumah I have to establish it into a food. V'lavochla, and they tell you to skip. But the concept here is, we'll read it. Kol hechadi ba'izarek matizarek lamash v'leyochla metamit masaychlin. Hechadi ba'izarek lematizarek lemash v'leyochla lemetamit masaychlin. What it's saying is, if I actually did the zrika, then I turned it into a food. But I need to turn it into something needs to change here. It's not a sanctity that's hovering around this, that once there's potential, the sanctity could leave, and then if I don't do the zrika, it's not going to come back. But over here, I actually have to turn it into a food, because right now it's not edible. And to get it into a food, that the zrika actually needs to be performed, and the potential doesn't count.